This is Tommy's Outdoors 109. One of the great things about recording this podcast is that I get to talk with some incredible people. And one of those incredible people is our guest today. His name is Moose Mutlow. And Moose works as a senior trainer in Yosemite Search and Rescue. But he accumulated like a lifetime of incredible experiences. So just to give you some idea, he was born and grew up in England, and he started teaching outdoor education there. And in general, he has like a 30 years of experience in traditional and alternative forms of education. Then he moved to south of France. Then he spent some time in Australia. Then he spent some time in Africa, where he was a teacher in Kalahari. He fished in Okavango. He moved to US, and in the USA, he was guiding and working for Outward Bound. And among other things, he was a fishery officer, social worker, principal at an elite sporting academy. And right now, he's directing construction of the $52 million worth of School of Environmental Education. No, so it's School of Environmental Science in Yosemite National Park. And by the time you're listening to this podcast, he will be teaching veterans canoe course on Everglades. Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. So, as it has, Moose has a book. Book is called When Accidents Happen, Managing Crisis Communication as a Family Liaison Officer. And the book is pretty technical and focused on being a family liaison officer. But I read the book, and there is a lot of universal wisdom in that book. How to communicate in emergency situations, how to be respectful, things like how to not make promises only because they will make you or people you talk to feel good. There is like a universal wisdom in that book. It's a good read. It's a good, quick read. And I would encourage you to read that book, especially if you're communicating with people, or you might need to communicate with people in stressful situations. So, look, we only had just a short of 2 hours to record this podcast, and with a guy like Moose, who has so many experiences, we could probably sit for a week talking. So I try to tease out as many interesting things from Moose in that short period of time, and I really think that you will enjoy it. And as usual, before you enjoy this episode of the Tommy's Outdoors podcast, just a reminder, share this podcast with your friends. It's a great help for me. And leave the rating, 5-star rating, leave the review, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. Leave the comment, share. This is great help for the podcast. And if you want to help me, now you can buy me a coffee. buymeacoffee.com/Tommy'sOutdoors. The link is in the description of the show down in the bottom. It is greatly appreciated. I really need some coffee when I sit long hours and edit those episodes for you. So, yep, that's it. And now, ladies and gentlemen, When Accidents Happen with Moose Mutlow. I'd say you'll be in the good hands. Moose, welcome to Tommy's Outdoors. Good to have you.
Thank you very much, Tommy. It's nice to be here. We're separated by a little bit of a distance, so thanks for making it work with the time difference.
Yeah, but with the modern technology, the distance is not a problem at all. Listen, man, I read, you obviously exchanged the emails before we get to this recording, and we had the chat, and wow, man, you had an impressive resume, and you've seen stuff, and you've been places. You could probably, divide that between 3 people and and that wouldn't be boring life, any of those three. So tell me, like, tell me and our listeners, like, what set you on this path of adventure and being in so many locations, doing so many amazing things?
Well, I've been very lucky. I mean, I've been fortunate. I think there was some really good timing that went on with it. I think growing up in Britain, which is a small island, and having a family that was exposed to a lot of international pieces. I have sisters that are linguists. My father was a business traveler. And so you got exposed a lot to the wider world from visitors or getting postcards from Australia from my dad. And you just sort of got inspired to start moving. So at 18, I pretty much started moving and kept moving for a long time.
Yeah. And where was you? Because you've been in Australia and in Africa, and right now you're in the US, for people who don't know.
Yeah, I got really lucky. I spent time working in and around Europe. I was a canoe guide with a summer camp program in the south of France, which was fantastic. I had a really good time with that. I managed a beach concession on the Mediterranean for a short time.
Whoa.
I ended up in Southern Africa and in Botswana for a bit. I taught a school in the Kalahari for a year. I spent time guiding in Australia. And then I ended up I kept coming back to the United States because career-wise, there was a lot more options for it to be sustainable, and spent a large amount of time working for a group called Outward Bound in North Carolina, and their base camps in Florida, the Voyager Outward Bound School. I worked for them down on the Texas border. And I'm actually going back to work for Outward Bound in about a month. I'm going to go and teach a veterans program down in the Everglades. It'll be my first course since 2005. But I'm looking forward to it.
Wow, that's and right now you're in the Yosemite National Park.
Right, I've been lucky. So the last 20 years, I've worked for a national environmental education program called Nature Bridge. It works in different national parks around the United States. And I was an education director, and now I'm the senior projects director, building a $50 million plus environmental science center in Yosemite National Park. And then as part of that, we work very closely with the National Park Service. And I essentially am able to leave my job and go and help support search and rescue operations in the park. And I do national park trainings regionally, like within Yosemite, and also on a national level.
Right. There's so many questions, man. We get to all of them. But before, like, when you were in Africa, like, you were teaching in a school, and you were guiding there as well, or you were also involved in like a safety and rescue operation?
I lived in a really remote area in the southern Kalahari for a brand new community junior secondary school that went in. The Botswana government had invested a huge amount of money in broadening educational opportunity for people. And I was recruited through the British Council, I think, at the time, to go out and teach. And every day's guiding out there because you're in a remote location. And I ended up not doing commercial stuff. We did a lot of safaris and trips. We went up into Zambia and Zimbabwe and down into the Republic. It was right before the elections that were happening in South Africa. But yeah, you're just in the wilds. We would have situations where your kids would end up having to go home, and they would leave to go to their villages, and they would leave en masse because you were worried about potential issues in and around lions.
Wow.
And then we had, go ahead.
No. I was just want to comment that this is quite often part of the discussions that people who live in Britain and Europe and in America, they expressing their opinions about lions and elephants and all that, but they don't have to deal with that. They never in a situation where their kids need to go home in groups because there are issues around lions, right?
Well, yeah, but I also think that people who grow up in that environment, they live with it. Like when you're in Alaska, all the precautions you take when you're out for grizzly bears are what people do every single day. What indigenous people did to live alongside polar bears in the Arctic, they do each and every day. we adapt, and a lot of times our inability to adapt is based on fear, because we don't understand and we don't want to learn, or we're too frightened to learn, because it means we have to change the way we look at the world.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, our kids, they weren't worried. They just knew how to be in that environment. They knew how to look after each other and themselves.
Mm-hmm. But still, you have to say like, yeah, go back home in group, because that might be not the great idea if you go.
Well, I had a great experience where we were in a safari camp, and you're kind of getting shut in at night in this particular safari camp, and the guy who shut us in locked the gate basically and put chain through it, and then he got on his bicycle and he rode to where he lives. And so you got this idea of, oh, we can't be trusted to look after ourselves. I'm going to look after you. And he understood the environment. It's like a lot of ideas around rewilding, when people get really, really excited about bringing larger predators in or reestablishing the natural order. It's actually, you just got to adapt the way you look at the world, the way we have chickens. We have a ranch out in the foothills, and we have bobcats out there and coyotes that predate chickens, and you have to put them away at night. When the sun goes down, you walk out, you lock them up. That's the way you adapt. It's not that big a deal. When lynx comes back, or to the UK and up in Scotland or wherever they're going to release it, people are just going to have to be more careful with their cats and their pets.
Yeah,
but it's a good sacrifice for this benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think like there is like you mentioned, there's a huge deal of fear, and quite often that fear is kind of fueled by media and some reports that they have nothing to do with the actual environment and what's going to happen, and it's like it's always getting very political, which is unfortunate.
Well, the news is on the extreme end. It sort of says, it doesn't say you'll be mildly inconvenienced by the release of beaver. It's like, it's going to be a terrible thing or it's going to be great. It's not like, actually, we'll just kind of adapt and it's going to be fine. For it to be news, it has to provoke a reaction. I mean, we almost get to a society where there's so much equality and it's so even that there is no reaction, because we're all like, oh, we can accept that. That's okay. And I think that there's a lot of lessons in the natural world about why trying to make things simple isn't beneficial. It's actually, the natural world is incredibly complex, and it sort of self-equalizes when it's given the chance. And you have to understand all those nuances. It takes effort and attention. You can't fix it in 30 minutes.
Yeah. But you're right. This is, and especially news and social media is never like a balanced approach. Like you said, there's always extremes, like, yeah, release wolves, they're gonna sort out deer problem, and beaver will come back, make the whole biodiversity to come back. And then there's like, no, they're gonna flood everything and will eat all your sheep and all your cows. And then there's like, no, it's neither of those. Somewhere
yeah, it's the nuttiest thing. Like, I think the United States, there's the wolf is a very it can be a very explosive issue, talking about wolves.
Tell me about it.
But like when this, originally, before the impacts of large amounts of people coming in, people talked about these enormous herds of animal, buffalo and elk, what have you, and they were regulated by predators. They like the natural balance is to have these megafauna out there, and it's good to be humbled in the landscape by something more powerful than you. It's like, we've talked before about buffalo and like European bison. You don't mess around with bison. They're an angry cow that needs to be left alone. And that's good in an environment to be like, I can't just walk anywhere. I have to have that awareness. And that's respect. And then when you learn respect, you can pass that on to your relationship with other people.
Yeah. Well, that's very good point. That's actually a very good point. Listen, how did you get on the path of being like connecting your job with the environment? right? Was it like you were always kind of like an outdoor kid and there was like no other option, or whether you secretly were dreaming about being and working for financial institution in a city, and then it changed something like how what happened that you got on that path of working with nature and in nature.
I'm really lucky. My parents had a real appreciation for the outdoors, and we always had access to the outdoors. So whether it was the garden, we had a pretty big garden when I was growing up as a kid, or we had a park down the end of the road called Sutton Park. It's the largest municipal park in Britain, and it's 7 miles all the way around. It has lakes and it has woods. And so I had all that access as a kid to this amazing natural landscape. And then just as I got older, I just enjoyed being outside doing activities. My dad built a boat in the backyard at some point. He built a mirror dinghy. It's this kit boat that fits on top of a Mini, and he like built it. He was an engineer, and he built this thing, and we went and sailed it on the local lake, and there was a rowboat there, and I got to learn how to row. And so I think my connection came through outdoor activity to access, to be able to see stuff. And then I think once I went through college and I started working summer camps and realizing I could actually do activities and I could get paid for them and I could have these adventures in these great places. That's when it started to be, I can start exploring these other landscapes. I can go to a place that's relatively empty. So
that was a matter of like, wow, they can actually pay me for that.
It's huge. Like the sudden realization that, I can make money guiding. It's like, I mean, you don't make great money. I have to say, like you have to figure out your hustles. I think at one point I figured out how to make like jewelry, and I had a mobile T-shirt printing business. I could silkscreen T-shirts. And I figured out some dodge for like getting people to pay me to print their T-shirts and do silkscreen design. And I started supplementing. And then I'd been guiding I'd worked in Outward Bound in Australia for a year, and I came back and I realized that to be recognized in outdoor education, which is kind of a fringe thing at the time, you had to have some credibility. So I went back and I trained as a classroom teacher at Bristol University. And that was the best thing I could have done. I fought it at the time, this formalization of education, but I was just being a bit of a brat. And it turned out to be really useful, because until you appreciate where young people spend most of their time, most of their educational time is the confine of a classroom. And it is up to the teacher to create this inspiring landscape to draw them into the thrill of learning. Unless you have that appreciation, when you have students just drop in for a few days or 3 weeks or whatever the time is, you don't give them any tools to go back to be more successful in the classroom if you don't understand how hard it is to learn in that environment.
Yeah. No, for sure. So you've been in outdoor education, in guiding. Like you were guiding for like fishing, hunting guide, or you just guiding to show people around?
I actually had a job very briefly in Southern Africa as a fishing guide on a river in the Transvaal, and I was like 19, and it was amazing, and I had a really good time. The family I worked for was actually the family of one of the lawyers that helped Mandela build his defense when the show trials happened. He was imprisoned in the 50s. And I worked for a very liberal family for a summer and had this profound experience of being in this beautiful place, doing this fly fishing with a split cane rod on primo trout water, but also being exposed to the horror of apartheid, like the absolute horror. And this family, the Brewer family, hid nothing. They did an amazing job of introducing me to the concept of what is social justice and the injustice that people do to each other. Like the apartheid the horror of apartheid is it was accepted by the world for so long, and it was, and we perpetuate that level of split in our society all the time, and we have to find common ground, and I think I was acutely aware of my privilege at that moment. It's never left me. Like it's a point I look back on and say that is a lesson that you can't forget.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah.
And I'm I'm going back to your guiding. So how did that work? Because usually you would imagine you were just so good at fishing and they were guiding, because usually I would expect that guide is a person who has like an in-depth knowledge of the area and knows every nook and cranny and so on. And there you are, 19-year-old guiding. Was it the matter that people were so clueless, or like how did that work?
No, I'd fished on and off as a kid, and then my first job when I left high school was I was a fishery officer on a big stately home in Britain for like 7 or 8 months, and I'd really fine-tuned how to fly fish. And guiding is a myth. Guiding is selling a myth. It's like, you probably know where the animals are, you kind of know where the fish are, and then you're taking these people on this adventure that they're going to be able to talk about. And so you're creating this, you're choreographing this story, and you know what the end goal is, and you actually know how it's probably going to figure out, and it's whether you're going to struggle along the way or you're going to make it easy for them. I mean, I know where all the fish are. They sit right in that eddy, right on that eddy line, and there's a big one in there because I saw it last week. And you can say, okay, I'm going to take this really special place. Nobody else has fished it for a long time. I think there's something in there. And you know there's a monster in there. And you're like, just drop that thing right on the edge. And no matter what you throw in the water, that it's going to eat it because it's high, cold water and it hasn't got a lot of food in it. And so boom. And then you're a hero. You're like, oh yeah, we got this big fish. Woo! And you very humbly are like, oh shucks, yeah, that's the way it is. And people are just looking for their story. We live in this environment where there are so few real stories because everything has some degree of, you kind of find a way to curate your story and make it perfect. And actually the best stories are just total imperfection, or all the things that have gone wrong. So if you can, as a guide, if you could bring that in, that surviving and overcoming, and it's kind of the hero's journey, like facing adversity, facing betrayal, and like, are you going to make it? And oh yeah, we've caught something. That's an important part of being a person, is being on that journey and having that thing to refer to. So that was my guiding background.
Gotcha.
And the same thing when it gets to like guiding on these big western rivers in the United States that have enormous volume, and you're out there for days and days and days. I mean, we were on the Grand Canyon for like nearly 3 weeks, and they're massive, massive waves. I mean, like incomprehensible amounts of water that you're rafting, and when you're rafting, you're just a little bit below the level of terror of what the guest is experiencing, right? You just got to manage your level of terror to manage their level of terror. So on these really big rapids, if it goes wrong and you lose an oar or something crazy happens, you're in trouble. But your face is not going to say that. There might be a little quaver in your voice, and you might have a little bit of Shakespeare that pops out, cry havoc, let loose the dogs of war or something. But you're managing them on this journey, and they come out at the end. And if they've had this great journey, there's 2 benefits. One, they leave as a punter just totally excited, and maybe you've given them some lesson in wild space and why we need to conserve it. Number 2 is they might tip you a little bit more money, which is always great. All right, let's be really clear. Like, that's subsidizing your minimum wage job. And maybe they'll come back. But we're all seeking a story.
That's very true. That is very
true. We talked earlier about your story, and I think your story is fantastic. The idea that you shared about, Poland joining the EU and then coming to this new country, becoming a citizen in a new country. I that resonates with me. I think that there's beauty in that to come and bring what you can to a new place. That's
Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I
That's
think that's a
nice.
I am I love that idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. Listen, um, so you're at some like I'm guessing now. You can correct me if I'm wrong, or like at some point you're transitioned or you started looking into the safety aspect of being in the outdoors. How that and I don't even know whether it's a transition or no. I let you comment on that. How this because you've been guiding, you've been educating, and then by reading your resume at some point you started to be involved in search and rescue and this sort of things.
Well, I think anybody who's involved in any sort of outdoor pursuit, be it climbing, kayaking, canoeing, surfing, at some point there's an accident. You're either having an accident and somebody's rescuing you, or you're watching an accident and you're choosing whether to be involved. So you start to develop this sort of risk management piece. And I'd started to train outward bound instructors in the mid 90s, maybe, and doing a lot more conscious training around how to manage activities and how to manage it when it goes wrong. And then that based on a lot of the expeditions I've done and adventures and sort of personal trips, it started to fill out a resume that said, "Oh, I actually have something to offer on a search and rescue end." And so in North Carolina, we had a little outward bound school. The North Carolina Outward Bound School was the technical response unit for the rural search and rescue unit. So anything that went vertical or was technical, we would assist this group of volunteers to safely accomplish these, to finish out a mission. And when I got involved with the Park Service, which was in 2000-ish, the federal government, the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service has a very comprehensive search and rescue program, and I tied into that first as a technician, so working just on straight carryouts and doing stuff on the water, and then that transitioned into a training role, and I trained to be a Rescue 3 instructor, which is one of the largest providers of certifications in swiftwater rescue and rigging. And then the longer you're in it, the more your resume builds and the more useful you become, because it isn't just about training people, it's having been on missions. And a lot of what I do or did was recovery, was actually being one of the people who was on the trying to figure out where somebody had disappeared and searching for them and then doing the body recovery. And then there's a lot to be. I think one of the things that can happen, and particularly in outdoor education, is you can have a whole bunch of outdoor certificates of leadership, and you can have all these qualifications. You spend all this money to get a qualification, but you don't necessarily have a lot of experience. And I think the American model, which rates experience very, very highly, like the only certificate they looked for was some sort of first aid certificate when I started, which was an involved first aid certificate, wilderness first aid. After that, it was just experience. Where have you guided? What trips have you done? How long have you been out? I mean, in Australia, I'd solo instructed 14 courses.
Wow.
Which is totally insane. With the largest group, I think, was 28 in the Northern Rivers. And you learn to be a really good manager of people in the outdoors. You learn real quick what works and doesn't work. And so that translates into that whole safety piece, is how do you start to work with people to be safe? Like I hate those trainings where people say, you know enough to be dangerous. Well, it was a pretty appalling training if you've just trained someone to be dangerous. We should be training people to be safe. And I think and so I think a lot about, how do I train you to make good decisions out there?
Yeah. That's well, this is a very good point, that being in the outdoors, like you said, you you've seen things, and even because you're so close to the elements, you're so close to water or wind or all these things, then it makes you appreciate the forces. And I guess this is also part of, like, probably when a lot of people are getting in trouble because they don't have this, right? We all heard the stories about people who going hiking in flip-flops to the mountains, or they, inadequately dressed or stuff like that because they just don't have a clue what's going on. So
yeah, there's a disconnect because people haven't been exposed. We should be anybody who goes outside to experience a peak or to like feel what it's like to be the outdoors, particularly after the last year. We should be doing everything we can to support them. And there's a lot of shaming around, oh, you're inadequately prepared, or you should never be out in flip-flops. And like, if you don't know what you should be doing, shaming isn't going to help. Shaming never helps. It's bullying. So you have to think about, how do I put this person in a position to be successful? So the program I work with, which is Nature Bridge in the national parks, we work with a lot of underserved communities. And it used to be this idea of, well, the mountains basically speak for themselves and they teach the lessons and people have a bad experience and they learn from it, it doesn't work like that.
yeah,
It's a
especially
hazing.
if someone dies, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. So what you want to do is give people the right equipment, show them how to use it, coach them while they're using it, and then, wow, they have success and they can look after themselves. I think this school of hard knocks and sort of Monday morning quarterbacking about how the accident happened and being very judgmental, it doesn't help. Like, the person's dead or the person's injured or they've had this horrible experience and they may never go out again. And that's a tragedy, because we need advocates for wild space. We need advocates for the outdoors. We need advocates to preserve the planet we live on. And that means everybody counts, not just one or two people. Everybody counts.
Yeah. And also being in the outdoors is probably not more dangerous than being in a busy city, or it's like you can equally get into trouble. It's just, arguably, like, I heard that many times from people who spend considerable time outdoors, and this is in every single way my experience as well, that when you're out, you're probably more afraid of other people. They would be more dangerous, right, than the animals, than the elements, they all these things. You go out and you camp, and you hunting deer or whatever else, and you can deal with cold, you can deal with rain, you can deal with wind. But then when a bunch of poachers roll in, that's tough. Not the cold, not the wind.
Right. It's the unpredictability of that part of it. Humans are unpredictable. Most animals, you kind of have an idea about what's going to happen. Like grizzlies, like when you're in grizzly country, we were up on the Copper River. It's Wrangell St. Elias. It's up in Alaska on the sort of right side. And we did this great run with one boat down to Cordova, which is on the coast. And you're very exposed. It's a big river. It's pretty well traveled, but we were the only boat out there. And we got out in areas where all you see is grizzly footprints. And grizzly footprints are they're enormous. They're well over a foot long, and you see the claw marks in the sand.
Yeah. I have a photo next my foot next to a brown bear in Poland. That's which is, it's slightly smaller, but it's similar size. And like you said, like, oh, this is big footprint. It's much bigger than my boot. And they're like, yeah, but you see those points there? These are its claws. It's like, whoa, you wouldn't want to.
Huge. And so you have, I love this, a friend of mine uses the phrase situational awareness a lot. And you have a high level of situational awareness because the salmon run is happening. And so the bears are congregating at these places where the creeks are running into the main river. And that's where you collect water, because that's clear water. The river is very silty. And so I'm focused on collecting water. And my friend Lincoln is there with a shotgun behind me. And he is fully on. Like, he is like He's aware of every movement around us and what's going on. But the reality is, if a bear really decided to move at that moment, it's closing at 42 feet per second. It's moving. It's a 1,000-pound animal moving at 42 feet per second. And so you're not going to be able to do much. So it's all the stuff you do before it, which is you project, you make sure they know you're there. You make enough noise for everybody to know, okay, we need to reshuffle here. And you manage the situation. And I think people want to be able to control everything, and we can't. We can influence it. And so you can influence the world around you to a degree, and then it's how other people respond. And I think we've got to a point where it's harder to figure out how people are going to respond. There are things that cloud response. Alcohol clouds response. Anger clouds response. Fear clouds response. So you project confidence, and you project honesty, and you try to project being transparent and non-threatening.
Mm-hmm.
It's, yeah.
Would you? I just want to stay for a second on the subject of bears. Is like grizzly bear? Is that true, or can you confirm that grizzly bear is really attacking you when you scare them, when it's surprised that you're there? It's because that's what I heard, that although black bears very seldom attack people, when they attack people, they have a bad intent. They want to, consume them. While grizzly, they're usually just scared, and their reaction is to neutralize threat and move on.
Yeah, if you look at a lot of grizzly bear reports of attacks, it's because somebody has inadvertently got between a sow and her cubs, or has walked up on a kill, and the bear is like displacing them. Or the bear's like old and it can't find another prey species. But for grizzlies, for the most part, they're also in more open country potentially, so they see you a bit more. I think that's a pretty good description. But they're high functioning. Like, bears are incredibly intelligent. Like they're making decisions. They're not just doing something. They're making a decision. They make a decision to walk away from you. They make a decision to avoid you. Black bears, it depends a lot about where black bear are. If black bear are being hunted, particularly with dogs, in areas where they're hunted by dogs, they're a lot more flighty. They like have a natural tendency to stay in the shadows. I mean, I spent a decade living in North Carolina in prime bear habitat, and I never saw a bear. But they were heavily hunted by dogs, so they knew to avoid people.
Yeah. Yeah. In your training courses, when you train people, when you talk to people, is the more danger coming from actual people being inadequately dressed, or doing some not respecting the water, doing that, or what element, what is the percentage of actual dangers that are coming from a wildlife, from bears and some snakes, and like, would it be fair to say that this is like a minuscule risk in comparison to someone getting inappropriately dressed and getting hypothermia or something like that?
There's a much better chance you're being struck by lightning than necessarily having a negative wildlife interaction. But having said that, if you were in Alaska and you were out on the Katmai during salmon season and you wanted to go down and wander around the salmon river, you're going to have a bear interaction. If you don't pack your food appropriately and have this sort of distant food area and a sleeping area separate in the Arctic, you may have a negative bear interaction. But like for the most part in the lower 48 in the US, while there are animal incidents, it's more likely, you're much more likely to twist an ankle, go wrong on a navigation exercise, make a terrible series of decisions that cascade into a bad outcome, than be attacked by something.
Yeah. And like you said, it's also that like we say that, oh, shark attacks are so rare, you're more likely to be, killed by bees or whatever
Yeah.
than being attacked by a shark. But if you're a surfer in an area where there's a lot of seals and a lot of sharks, and you're in the water, 200 days or 180 days a year, well, then your probability goes up. You're probably more likely being, bitten by shark than killed by bees.
Well, it kind of comes to that point of whether you're prepared to modify your behavior. So I live in a rural area, and one of my neighbors just told me that he isn't riding at the moment because we've got too many black bears coming in, because there's very little water in the surrounding areas, and there's good water where we live, and mountain lions. And then I was at a meeting like 2 days ago, and a friend of mine was like, "Oh yeah, I drove through town, and there was a big mountain lion right on the road." And you modify, how willing are you to modify what you do to preserve the natural world? Because the way I always thought about it when I mountain biked in these areas is I had a high level of awareness all the time, and I would go on my bike rides in the middle of the day rather than the evening or early morning, to reduce the chance of me having a negative interaction with the mountain lion. It's already low, if it's mountain in the area, but the mornings and the evenings, you're more likely to bump into something because that's kind of when they're active. So yeah, if you want to go swimming with the seals, then you may have a negative interaction with a great white. If you want to go hand fishing for salmon in the Katmai, you're probably going to have a negative experience with grizzly. Or people do crazy stuff, like in Yellowstone National Park. People are always getting out and they're trying to pet the buffalo, and it's this super.
Yes, I think I saw. I think I seen these videos where someone just goes flying because the buffalo kind of like, get out of the other.
Yeah, they're totally, and it's this disconnect. It's like, on the one hand, it's stupid. Like, people have these terrible accidents getting in these scalding hot water features in Yellowstone. And Yellowstone's amazing. There are these basins with like geysers going off and mud sort of boiling, and somebody's dog like jumped in one of the pools, and the person jumped in to get it, and the water's super heated, and she got like burns over 90% of her body, and it's just this sort of, the one hand, she responded to her dog. She's trying to rescue her dog. But then the thinking isn't there of like, oh, this water's incredibly scalding, I'm going to be in trouble, because you just haven't been exposed to those things before. And it's just tragic. And all these people every year in in Yosemite National Park, there are probably 12 to 18 deaths a year. I think I've worked 7 or 8 this year, and they have the full range of a tragic accident, and then somebody just they have a cardiac arrest, or they just don't wake up from the sleep. It's an unexplained natural death, and none of them came here planning to die. It's just this sort of tragic thing that happens. Or there's a thing of beauty. Like years ago, I responded to a death with somebody who just hadn't woken up, and their family was there, and they'd gone to wake their family member in the morning, and they hadn't woken up. And there was this amazing thing, because the family were reflecting how much that person loved the national park and how many years they'd been coming. They'd been coming for decades, and they died in this place that they loved. And then all of this community around them started coming in to share or to witness this loss. And I think that's something that doesn't happen a lot in society, is that when death happens, we tend to move away and be like, oh, I'm not too sure what to say. So we distance ourselves, and we leave these grieving people even more isolated. At that moment, this campsite stepped up, and they discussed this person's life, and they were sharing stories, and there was tears, and there was laughter. And it was the most wonderful thing to have this celebration and recognition of this person's worth. And I think that's another part of the job that I work, which is family liaison, which is when we have a search or we have a recovery. So when you say search, it's viable. We're looking for a live person. When we move to recovery, we've accepted or have information the person is dead. I work with the families to be the voice of the incident command to allow them to hear what's going on and also to ask questions. And I figure out how to get the responses they need. And a big part of that job is being there at a time when a family is in crisis because they've had this thing that's flipped their world, and you're there to help. You're there to provide not necessarily not grief counseling, but you're there to be present and caring.
And this is like excellent moment to mention that you have a book.
I do.
When Accident Happens. Title is When Accident Happens, Managing Crisis Communication as a Family Liaison Officer. There you go. That's the book. And it's a really detailed, you're going into a lot of details, like exactly what is the role and why that role is needed for family liaison officer. When I was reading the book, the question that because there's so many different types of these accidents, right? There are some that are taking several hours, and there are some that goes on for days. So and you kind of like going through all the scenarios and all the possible options. But there's in the rescue team, there is also option of like just liaison officer. Why there's a specifically need a family liaison officer, or is that role interchangeable?
Well, when an operation is running, the incident commander is completely focused on resolving whatever the challenge is. So we've got a disappeared person. They've been gone for 4 days. It's a light aircraft crash in the backcountry. There's a big winter storm coming in. The incident commander is focused on how do I get my air support ground teams? How do I safely deploy in the field for a search? How do I coordinate that whole thing? If that person has to work directly with the family, there is a profound emotional load that they will take on. It's unavoidable because you're seeing people who are like, where is my dad? What are you doing? Why aren't you doing this? And so essentially the family liaison officer provides the insulation from the response, that search, that allows everybody to concentrate on their task and meets the family where they're at, and then helps to sort out what they need and bring that to the incident commander at very specific times where they can respond. So it's essentially giving a buffer and insulation between the ops and the family's needs. And when the family doesn't feel like it's getting what it needs, it can either go on social media or go to mainstream media, and it can start saying, we've probably all heard it, I don't know what's going on. Nobody's telling me anything. And that's the sign quite often of not having a working family liaison setup. They can still get frustrated with you. They can still be disappointed. But your job is to give them undeniable facts. So we have 120 people on the ground. They're searching 4 different sectors. We're running 2 helicopter operations. We've got a storm coming in 2 days. We're going to reevaluate at 4 o'clock whether we're evacuating those people or we're leaving them on the ground. Those are all the things that you're conveying. And you're breaking it down into a very complex series of like sheets and acronyms. You're breaking it down to a digestible form and giving them it in writing so that they can do something with it.
Yeah. And when I was reading the book, my thought was that the advice, I don't even know whether it's an advice or whether it's just instructing about different things, that has application in so many situations in life. This is like this is to some extent very extreme situation where you have this family who is gravely worried about their family member, their son. They're like, this is really tough and hard situation. But in those situations, all the rules that apply in those situations, they are just amplified, but they're equally apply to every day, like how you speak to people, how it very much resonated with me. Like, you not try to promise anything, you not try to smooth it over or sweeten anything. You're just giving facts. You communicating clearly with respect and with having in mind like what is your role, what you're trying to. And I was reading that, and it's like, man, like, this is not only for people who want to go to search and rescue or be family liaison officer. Like, anyone, I think, who deals with people and communicates with people in their day-to-day job. For example, you're a leader in a company, man, that's a lot of lessons there that can be applied in day to day.
Yeah, we've had entire societies traumatized by COVID and sort of been distanced in communication. And it's something that I have to work on every day. I mean, I'm not perfect. Like, I'm a deeply flawed person. Like, I think the book I wrote is a really good eye opener for me too, and a reminder is to try and be kind and treat people with respect at all times. And try to recognize where people are at. Like, when you're in a store and there's somebody ahead of you and they've got kids and it's taking forever for them to check their stuff out and the kid keeps throwing stuff, and have a little bit of compassion. Like, for the last year and a half, that person was a parent and a teacher and a social worker, and they were trying to hold all these things together. Be kind. Like, it takes a lot less effort. Be less judgmental.
Yeah, man, that's it. Moose, preach. Be less judgmental. This is what I see on social media. Like, people, like, their entire personas are sometimes hinged around judging people, and this is wrong, this is this, they should do this, they should do that. It's like, come on, just give a little bit of a leeway.
But also think about how lonely those people are. Like, what life are they living that is the way they have, that's the only way they have to express their frustrations or have control? How sad an existence that must be. Like, to spend that much time on hate. Hate takes so much effort. Like, to hate something takes an extraordinary amount of commitment and like effort, and it just draws you down. Whereas love and kindness is actually a lot more relaxing, and it's a lot more beneficial, and it's actually easier for the most part. There's definitely sometimes it's really hard to love. You're like, oh God, like, how am I going to get to that point? But the idea of being less judgmental is to be empathetic, is to be, and I was struck by this because when I've dealt with, over the years, colleagues who've ended their lives, and I've worked with members of the public who've ended their lives. And the first time I dealt with a suicide incident, in the back of my mind, had so much judgment. I had all of this idea about how selfish this person had been and how they had not thought about anybody else. And it really mulled around. And then I started working with the family, and very quickly I had this picture painted of how wonderful this person was, that they were multilingual, they'd had all of these cool experiences, and they'd also had some really challenging, hard times, and they'd had incredible obstacles to overcome. And at some point, it had become so much that they saw the only way forward was to end their life. And I was like, oh, I'm a complete idiot here, because I didn't have to have judgment at any time during this. All I had to have was compassion and empathy and care, because the tragedy has happened. It doesn't need me to come in on the back end and make it worse. And I think when people, I've had colleagues who've ended their lives because of issues in and around the pressures of work, the struggles they've gone through with mental health, and that was their out. And I am troubled by that still, because you wonder what else you could do. But the other thing is, I must never have judgment. I must never say it's nothing but a tragedy. It's nothing but a tragedy when someone ends their life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very unfortunate always. And you're right. This is all about saying, I often say, like, I disagree with someone, but I understand how they could think that way. I think this is like, no one tells you or anyone that you need to, agree with someone, but it's just you understand what is their motivation. Like, I in many in all conversations, this kind of like how that person could arrive at that. I could see myself being that person, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and there's an insidious group that will maneuver always for power, right? And that's kind of the lesson of society is who you elect is going to represent you, but do they actually represent you? And I think in my experiences around the world, I would say I've experienced the very worst in people, like terrible seen and witnessed terrible cruelty. But I've also in the same culture seen incredible kindness and generosity, and that we have that capability. We all have that opportunity to be kinder and to listen and to also call out injustice and to say, hey, I have privilege here and I need to be quiet and let other people speak. And I need to be there as an ally and to support change in society. And in the same way, I need to stand up for injustice and I need to shout very loudly when something is wrong. Um, and I think we're at this position where society seems to be losing hope.
I think so.
And actually, this is the time where me in my generation has to be talking about hope, because we need to inspire young people to realize there is a way forward and that they've got a very difficult burden. But we need to talk with optimism about the future, because if we lose young people's as a sort of future for looking after the world, for fixing what we've done to it environmentally, for being more equitable in society, if we lose their enthusiasm and their innovation, that will take more than 100 years to catch up. And so I think wild spaces and nature has a real role to reset people on feeling good, on feeling the forces of nature and feeling the refreshment and how that can top you up. And with really good guided discussion, you can get a lot of people to buy into that. And then you use that as the leaping off point for creating a fairer society for not just individuals and different cultures, but for all the animals, the plants, everything that inhabits our world needs to have people who speak up for it.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And you're touching on this idea that we spoke on the podcast many times, where how therapeutic nature is and being outdoor is, and for your mental health and for your well-being and for like everything. You go somewhere, outdoors to the woods or whatever, you step out of the car and you go like, like everything is slower. Everything goes slower. You kind of feel more, see more. You're all of a sudden discover that you have a sense of smell and you can smell all the things, not only like a car exhaust.
and your resting pulse comes down.
Yes.
And your respirations become deeper, and you suddenly have room in your head to think about other stuff. One of the things I work with is this thing called psychological first aid. It's based around something called the stress continuum that was developed by the Marine Corps in the United States, and it kind of grades you about whether you're functioning or you're injured. It's like 4 categories. And you look at it as far as your mental health into, like, if you're in green, right, you're functioning, you've got healthy relationships, you've got connections in your community, you're doing the things you love to do, you're eating healthily, you're making healthy decisions. If you're in the red, you're injured. It's at a point where the trauma that you've experienced has actually put you in a position where you can't handle complexity. You isolate. You start doing unhealthy things. You go into this cycle of depression. And it's this tool to allow you to sort of recognize where you and your colleagues are at. We use it in search and rescue a lot to like look at the impact of missions and to help you as a peer or colleague to either help somebody track back into green, into this healthy position, or help them seek professional care when they're up on that red end. The thing I think about a lot is trauma. So we've all been through a traumatic experience with COVID. And trauma, a good definition of trauma that I like is the idea that you're unable to live the life you want to live because you had this thing that's stopping you.
Yeah.
And so people can be traumatized through war, and they see terrible things and they do terrible things. People can be traumatized from childhood. People can be traumatized from being a witness to a bombing. People can be traumatized X, Y. There's lots of reasons why, but it manifests in the same way. And one of the key things that turns up is when you're in that latter stage of reacting, sort of heading towards being injured, you stop doing the things that you love. So you stop. We looked at ski patrollers who do this, and ski patrollers talk about they don't make the extra effort to go out and get fresh tracks in the morning or go to secret powder stashes up on the hill. They don't do that. They used to do that, and they don't do it anymore. For me, I had a kind of a rough summer, and we tried to figure out what was going on. And the thing I used to do is I used to be on the water as much as I could. I'd be in the water or on the water boating as much as I could. And I was like, oh, I got to get back to being on the water. So I bought a roof rack. I got my boat on top of my car ready to go. Everywhere I drive, my boat's on the roof. And so I can get on the river on the way to work, back from work. I can do that. So I used to do it, is now I always do it. I'm back in green with that. And I think it's society, we need to sort of be honest about how trauma affects each and every one of us, and not be judgmental, but think about how we work together to produce something that's healthier. So in search and rescue, a big part is connection. It's like you need to be connected to your peers. And so there's a sort of social aspect, there's a check-in aspect, there's a sort of openness to people struggling and not being judgmental, so that we can get to this healthier position, because you see some gnarly stuff in search and rescue.
Yeah, I can imagine. And listen, so I have a question. Like when you're like you're in the red, or you're going in the red, and you notice that you're, not doing things you love, right? You used to be going fishing, or you used to go and be, boating or whatever, and you're not doing. Can you kind of force yourself into doing this, and that way you push yourself more towards green, or is it doesn't work that way? You need to work differently. Oh, you can.
There are some people who are able to do that. Like one of the exercises I do is I have people identify this sort of, what do you do when you're healthy in relationships? What do you do when you're healthy when you're eating healthily? And so they have this roadmap that says, this is green. And so when they get into that really stressed out end, they look back at that piece of paper that's hopefully on their refrigerator, and they go, oh, I need to do this. I'm not being physically active. Like when I'm not physically active, I'm a bad bear. Like I'm not happy. I have to be physically active. So if I'm cooped up inside because we've got a 3-week fire running and it's just dumping 300 and 400 count air particulate on the house, you can't go outside. You've got to do something. So we bought fitness equipment, and I can get on my spin bike or the row machine, and I can be physically active indoors. But some people can find their way back. They can be guided back by their families. But there's also, if you're living in that red zone, that where you're injured, your body has changed. So you go from this fight, flight, adrenaline sort of response where you see something, is that a bear? You sort of, everything elevates, and then you realize it's a bush, it's not a bear. And then there's this mental thing that goes dink, and it flips it, and it actually tells you to sort of to stop being aroused. It takes you out of that fight flight. When you're in the red, you're in hyper arousal. and you're actually using a hormone called cortisol, which is physically changes your body. It like lays down fat. If you see cops and they have a big fat belly, that isn't just donuts. That's stress. That's cortisol laying down fat because the body's saying, hey, we might be in trouble. We need to have a food source for later, in simplistic terms.
Gotcha. Oh, that's interesting.
So you have to change. So this hyperarousal, you have to find a way to snap out of being in hyperarousal and accept that you're safe in order to reverse back to a healthy position. It's a lot of science, and I'm kind of sitting here riffing on it. But it's really well backed up in practice. That if you start looking at your family or your friends around you, you'll start picking out where people are at, and you'll understand why, because they've got kids at home and they're trying to teach, and they just lost their job, and so-and-so's got COVID. Like this entire cocktail of challenge and trauma is happening to all of us.
Yeah, that's very good point and very interesting. Maybe now it's a good moment to ask you. Like you mentioned you mentioned that obviously in your book, but also something that interests me, like the importance of physical fitness for being safe in the outdoors, but also you mentioned the importance of the exercise and fitness for a job in a search and rescue or in these sort of teams. I'm curious your comments. I presume this is like both the mental aspect that we just discussed, but also being physically fit and in shape, and it makes you on one hand safer if you're in the outdoors, and on the other hand lets you better do your job during actions during.
Yeah, I mean you've got to be fit for the art that you're being asked to practice. So in Yosemite, we have a lot of really technical rock rescue, and it's world renowned for rock climbing. It's Rocktober right now in Yosemite, which means there are thousands of climbers have descended to take advantage of this cold, clear weather that we have. And so if you're going to be on the climbing end, the technical end there, you need to be able to climb hard. I'm talking really hard, and have multiple ascents on these 2,500, 3,000 foot routes to get on the squad. Like I'm good at like going in a helicopter, being dropped at the top and saying, look at that knot and tell me when it's not working. That's my job on technical rigging. Like I'm not up on the rock face doing anything because they don't climb hard enough and they don't have that interest. But to be on the water, I need to be out either swimming or I need to be out boating, and I need to be around the river a lot, checking out hazards and seeing what's going on. You need to practice your art if you're going to be involved in rescue, because it's your personal experience that will keep you safe. Not necessarily your training. It's the depth of personal experience that you bring, because that's where you build an intuitive response. That's where your body mechanic works naturally. So if you're not used to walking across talus slopes and jumping from this little pinnacle to the next one with a big pack on, then you are going to get injured. If you haven't done that as a daily run, you're going to get injured because you're not used to it. So you don't have to be superhuman, but you have to be robust.
Yeah. So what would be your recommendation for like training, like exercises for outdoors people? Is there like a basic stuff that you would recommend for absolutely anyone?
Well, I think when you get old, like me, it's low impact because your body's kind of on the edge of breaking. So I do a lot of cycling because that's really good for just stamina, and it doesn't stress out your joints. In the summer, I'll try and swim and just be in the water. And then I boat like 2 or 3 times a week. I'll try and get out and just be working my muscles and making sure I got my balance point out there. And then you'll see people who sort of have different approaches, like CrossFit. Do you have CrossFit in Ireland?
Yeah, like everywhere, I think.
Yeah, it's like it's like a cult. You know,
A bit,
it's like
yeah, a bit
it's
like, yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's just like people shouting at each other and talking about. I love that joke which says, "How do you know someone does CrossFit? Because they keep telling you over and over and over
Yeah,
and
they tell
over
you about
again." Yeah,
it.
and they always tell you, which is great. Like they're out there doing their thing. They found that thing that works for them. I think everybody has to find the thing that works for them. But whatever it is, if you can do it outside, it will bring more reward because there's more research that's saying how natural light affects us, like morning light and evening light, and how feeling the wind on your face and not the sweaty gym is different. And then having the textures and the sounds and all of those things, it's the natural symphony that we need to sort of listen to. And I think the more you immerse yourself in your fitness program in that landscape, the healthier you'll be. Like you're on the coast. Do you know what the sound of the waves is like?
I do. I do. I also know what the sound of the winter storms is like.
Yes. And so to go out and feel that spray and feel that wind carrying the salt all the way inland, and seeing the seagulls start to decide they don't want to be on the coast anymore and come on, like that's all part of fitness. It isn't just muscles. It's this sort of elasticity of your brain constantly being stimulated and learning and registering and reacting to natural things. It's I think back to like as a kid, we were in a safari park, these sort of nutty, high fence things with a bunch of animals in it.
Uh-huh.
And we saw a giraffe give birth. I must have been like 7 years old. And I looked over and there was a giraffe with 6 legs. And then it's very dramatic because the giraffe calf comes from this enormous height and just hits the ground.
Yeah.
I saw that when I was a kid and I remember it. And like, it's all of that's that sort of elasticity, all that's fitness, all of that telling stories, remembering things, coming back to it. If you're just indoors, it's harder to have compelling stories. It's harder to have the range of stories. So it'd be great if you could have indoor stories and outdoor stories, because that's more. So your fitness, if you can get outside, you can have more stories.
That's very well explained, Moose. I love it. And yeah, for sure there are people who, like we like I said, we're privileged in some way that we have the access to outdoors, right?
Oh yeah, hugely.
There's a lot of people who just live in the city or in town, and they're going to the gym or even having a gym at home is their only option, because going outdoors is drive is hour drive, 2 hour drive, they can't afford that. So for sure they will stay fit doing what they can. But I agree, like whenever you have an opportunity, man, you got to go out and like feel that wind on your face.
So I grew up in Birmingham, in the middle of England, and my dad loves Birmingham. My dad's traveled the world, like as a businessman, but he loves Birmingham. And Aston Villa's my soccer team, very proud Brummie. And my dad on Sundays, every once in a while, we would drive and go in the city and we would explore it. And he would be very proud to say 2 things about Birmingham. One of them is the bell that was on the Titanic was made in Birmingham, right? And he'll say, I'll tell you one thing that worked on that ship, the bell worked. All right, which I really like that story. And the other thing is that Birmingham has more miles of canal than Venice. So below the street level, there's this myriad of canals that Birmingham has rediscovered, because it was an industrial hub and there were all these warehouses. And we would go to Gas Street Basin and we'd walk up and down the canals. And I loved it because there was like this subterranean world below the city with all of this myriad of ways to get around. And so when I say get outside, it doesn't have to be, there's nature in cities. There's nature everywhere. There's little flowers coming up through the pavement that you can look at and go, oh my God, that's fetched. That is actually edible. I don't know whether I would eat it in the city because it's covered in lead. But like there are fish in the canals, there are ducks in the canals, there are voles in the canals. There are all these things that we just look for detail. And I think there are a lot of people, undoubtedly, who are underserved by their elected officials in having open space. But with public transport, there's opportunity. And I think I loved wandering around the neighborhood. When I lived in Bristol, I loved wandering around Bristol because there are all these sort of quirky little neighborhoods, and they all have their own character, and they have this richness in culture. And so,
Mhm.
and that's that other piece about adventuring and expeditioning is I've been very lucky to go to the Arctic. I've been very lucky to go to the Central Kalahari. I've had all this fortune, but I also really enjoy exploring out of my backyard. Like I love discovering stuff, a new road to bike on, a funny little rock outcrop, a new bend in the river. There's all this adventure in our backyards that in Britain, when I was growing up, there were a lot of books out there about adventures in the backyards because we didn't have a lot of giant wildlife.
Mhm.
And I would get excited about hedgehogs, and I would get excited about sparrows. And again, it's not better or worse; it just is. So I think it's there. You just need to have somebody who's gonna mentor you or encourage you sometimes to take that step to enjoyment and knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Out of your all your travels and all the places that you've been, um which is there one that you would say is like most dangerous, most likely to have an accident, or is it all depends on people rather than actual location?
Oh, Australia is really hard to beat.
I like. I didn't want to say that. Like, why? Why is it because of all the poisonous snakes and spiders and stuff like that? Is that
Well,
the reason?
some of my family is Australian, and I at some point one of them said, "How can you tell an Australian when they're going to throw a stick for the dog?" And I
Mhm.
was like, "I don't know." And he goes, "Well, you kick the stick because you don't know if it's a snake. Like you don't just reach down and grab something." And it's always stayed with me. And so in Australia, there is so much that you can get in trouble with. Like there's snakes, there's spiders, there's jellyfish, I had a crocodile briefing. Like when I was working in Queensland, I literally had someone sit down with me and go, this is what we're going to do with the crocodiles. And like you're like, oh my god, are you being serious? And they had a rule which was if you slept next to a watercourse, the instructor would be closest to the water, with the theory that a crocodile coming up and out the water would take you first. That is a really good rule for making sure you camp a long way back from the water. Um, and then I had kids capturing there's a snake called the red-bellied black snake, and
Mhm.
I want to say it's in the top 10 poisonous snakes. It's not a particularly aggressive snake. It's just got really strong venom. I had a student catch one to bring it back into camp to show me, like, hey, check this out. He had like a 4-foot red-bellied black snake that was all wriggly. I'm like, you need to go and put that down right now. And he like went and put it down. We had somebody disappear. We had an instructor who was doing a resupply on Hinchinbrook Island. Hinchinbrook Island's on the east coast. It's out from Ingham. It's subtropical, and it's covered in stuff that can bite you, and it's got a lot of crocodiles in that area. And we had somebody who didn't come in that night, so we were out on the beach, which is also dangerous. Like we climbed some sort of light tower to see if we could see his light out there. And he had this little motorboat, and he just decided not to do the crossing because it had got choppy and the tides were playing up. And we didn't know for 12 hours whether a crocodile had got him. So
Oh
it's like
God.
it's but that's exciting. Like the rush of everything being okay. It sounds awful because it's sort of you're on the edge of this disaster, but the relief is this profound thing. But Australia, hands down, for stuff that can go wrong, is like
Okay. Okay, hands down. How about Africa? Is it like a second? Is it like on a distant second?
yeah. I mean, like you could be really dumb out there. Like you see a lot of people doing dumb stuff, like
Hmm.
elephants Botswana has probably has the last, or has had the last of the great herds in Africa, because it had a particularly aggressive anti-poaching policy, and so we saw a very large herd of elephant, and you can get close to elephant if they see you and they figure out you're not threatening. And you're respectful. You can be 25, 30 feet away when the herd comes through, which we were. And then somebody went out there who's a bit rowdy and drunk, and they got charged like 5 minutes later. And you're like, well, that was kind of dumb. Hippos are the thing you kind of watch out for. We went fishing on the Okavango.
Oh, wow.
Big river that comes down out of Angola, and it gets geographically confused, and it doesn't go to the ocean. It goes out and just flows out to the Kalahari and just sinks into the sand. And it's this enormous river, this great delta. And you're out there fishing for tigerfish, I think we were fishing for. And the guide is in this little motorboat, and they're like looking around. And then you hear this like, and that's the hippos. And you're like, uh-oh. And you just got to figure out where you need to be. Yeah. It's so lucky. I mean, there was this show in Britain on Sunday nights called The World About Us when I was growing up. And we'd watch it at 7:30 or something on a Sunday. And sometimes it would be so boring. It would be around for me, boring, like nuclear physics. I wasn't that excited about that. But if it was about Africa and about like Jane Goodall or something like that, they would have this 30-minute show. And it was awesome because you got exposed to this world. And then I read these books by Gerald Durrell, which were like, he was a animal collector who had a zoo ultimately in Jersey. And I just vacuumed those up. And then years later, I was working in Bristol Zoo, and I met one of the guys who was in Gerald Durrell's books.
Oh, wow.
And I'm talking to this guy, and it suddenly becomes clear that as a kid, I had read about this guy, and it's England. We're not good at emotions. And I break down in tears in his office because it's just too much. And Chris looks very uncomfortable. He's just like shuffling papers and like this. And I sort of spent a few minutes trying to get myself together because I've met one of my heroes.
Yes.
And then a few years ago, Jane Goodall did a talk for our organization. And I love Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall is this hugely influential conservationist and this person who's on this mission. And I had this moment to go and shake her hand, and I didn't because I was too nervous.
Oh, wow.
But at the same time, there's part of me, it's like it's preserved this sort of star quality because I can't remember how we got to this point, but like there are these influences in our life that we don't know about until much later.
Mm-hmm.
And you rely on your parents or your siblings or your friends to sort of inadvertently give you these opportunities. My parents made very conscious decisions about the natural world. They made very conscious decisions about educational opportunity. And I have benefited enormously from that, profoundly. My life it wouldn't have been worse, it would have been different. And I've had this adventurous life because of these sacrifices and these decisions my parents made. And I'm eternally grateful for that. And so, in a way, we should look at everybody around us as being our kids and our friends as our kids, because you want to give them the best. So how do you give everybody your best and give opportunity? How do we look at society as a family that we try to give a better world? And I think my parents' generation gave their kids a better world, and then we squandered it.
You think so?
Yeah, I think we did. I think we've made decisions in my generation that have not been beneficial to the next generation, and we have to be accountable to that. And we have to have not a reckoning, but we have to have we have to articulate that, and we have to figure out a way out of it. And it goes back to that message of hope and optimism. We have to make sacrifices for the next generation. We have to change the way we do things.
No, that's for sure. When it comes to, our connection with nature, let's say, Yeah, man. I gotta admit, we've done a terrible job. But like you always have this other side that but look, education. There's less people living in poverty than everywhere, and there's probably also much safer, and all these things. So um, maybe it was just too much to do everything at once. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and I think there's still massive inequality. Like you look at
True.
entire continents that haven't got access to COVID vaccine. You look at our own societies, places that have had historical disparity and are undisturbed remain underserved. And we perpetuated a sort of destruction of the natural world at a cost to largely. There's an interesting argument about conservation, which, if you look at it and you look at the idea of what conservation is, there's a legitimate argument that conservation has a significant impact on indigenous people. Like if you look at national parks, national parks removed indigenous people from their boundaries and said, ta-da, here we've got all these animals. And you're like, yeah, but these people over here, this culture has been living in harmony with these animals for millennia. And we've got this sort of arrogance that says, this is the way, and it isn't. And in the United States, there's this massive awakening around fire, the Mediterranean in particular, Mediterranean climate, where indigenous culture that was here for millennia, used fire to preserve and maintain natural habitats. So they perpetuated regular burns, they reduced fuel load, they changed the stands into these magnificent forests that supported these enormous herds of animals, or the grasslands that supported all the buffalo, through the use of fire. And now fire agencies are going back to traditional users and saying, how did you use fire? When did you burn? What type of fire did you burn? How intense? And so we arrogantly think fire science is this new thing because it's like been around from the 70s with the title. But actually it's been around for like umpteen thousand years. And there's this amazing knowledge in Australia, in Southern Africa, probably through the Mediterranean. I don't know specifically on indigenous culture in the Mediterranean, but in North America, you are seeing crews of tribal representatives now playing a more active role in some places, by no long mean nationally, in introducing sane fire regimes into natural systems.
That's interesting. That's interesting conversation because among many people, let's call them environmentalists, right? Let's use this umbrella term, environmentalists. They, you almost see the sentiment of humans is all bad. We need to go back to the natural way, and we need to go back because whatever humans done, the intervention, the hunting, the whatever is bad. But then, they're quickly getting against the argument, like you said, like, well, yeah, but people were here for like, it's not like last 200 years, right? And like, is it? But so where you go? Where you doing this sort of colonialist conservation that no people in there, like, let's get it, and even there are discussions where you don't need to go that far to hundreds or thousands years, but even like right now, discussions about rewilding in Scotland. There is a lot of people who pushing back and say like, hey, we live here, right? Like how can you talk about the Scottish Highlands as a blank canvas where we're gonna rewild and put all the wolves and all that? Like there is a culture of people who live there actually, and they in some sort of a harmony. It's hard, man. It's like I'm not pretending that I have an answers to that. It's very complex.
It is, and I think in communities or countries where they have so little, why should the West sit there and say, "But you need to save that," like because we've ruined ours. Like we got rid of it.
Exactly.
Like we got
Yeah.
rid of our forests, like by building these ships to come to your country, like umpteen centuries ago. Like we have to be really use the word colonialism. I think that's it. There's an educational load to that. Like, it's okay to talk about the truth and the horror of this, because otherwise we don't really reconcile. We have no reconciliation to move forward on. And you don't build a future school of thinking by ignoring the past. You have to consider it today to produce a better tomorrow. And I think the hunting's a really interesting one. Is I went through this whole thing around hunting is good or bad. One of the things that preserves public lands, and public lands in the United States cover millions of acres. It's massive amount of land that we have access to as public lands. And one of the loudest lobbies is the hunting lobby, and they elk hunters, deer hunters, and there's a resistance sometimes for them to be at the table. But in truth, in some ways, they have a more intuitive understanding of the land and the way that the relationships happen than many other groups. They definitely have it, more than a mountain biker zipping through. These people are sitting behind a tree for 4 days waiting for a bull elk to come through, bugling and listening to the sound of grass moving. Like they're immersed.
They
And I
know
think
the wind, they know the thermals, they know all these things.
And so up in the northwest part of the United States, there's a peninsula that comes out from opposite Seattle called the Olympic Peninsula, and out on the northwest corner is the tribal lands of the Makah, and the Makah are the only tribal group that were allowed to harvest gray whales in the lower 48. And it was a very controversial thing when it started back up. But this tribal group, their identity is tied up with the ocean, is tied up with millennia of harvesting on a sustainable take. And who am I to turn around and say your cultural value, the thing that your culture revolves around, the whale, you shouldn't have that right to do it. Like if the purity of environmentalism, or the thing that the catch-all is this idea of stopping people from doing stuff is what a lot of opponents come out with. And I think we need to shift the conversation to what it allows us to do, to have healthy ecosystems, to have contiguous wildlife corridors that allow for migration that is uninterrupted, to have conscious thought about management so that people who struggle because of a sheep kill, because of lynx or because of wolf, they are compensated. So there's balance there, but you can't have farmers pitted against bird watchers, pitted against fell runners, pitted against that. You actually all have a common interest, which is access and use.
Man, this is like a guiding theme almost of the podcast, that there's a common ground, and there's so unfortunate that we seems to be focusing so much on what is dividing us rather than where is a common ground. I find it very unfortunate. There's one other thing. There's many other things I would like to know your view on, and in your opinion. We don't have that much time to cover everything, but you mentioned that whale hunting, so I had a lot of discussions just recently around whaling that goes in the Faroes, and you obviously familiar with the situation, and the discussion was around, like, so obviously there's like proponents, or let's say Faroese, say like, yeah, the hunt is sustainable. Again, it's embedded in our culture. We've done this for many hundreds or thousands years. The whales are getting eaten. This is a source of food, and so on and so forth. And then obviously there's always this argument, like, well, the fact that you've done something for hundreds of years doesn't mean that you have to continue to do that, right? We were, raping for thousands of years doesn't mean that we have to continue to do that. But then the interesting part of the argument is like, yeah, but if this is tradition, you should be doing that under oars, not using your
Right.
boats, right? But then my thinking is like, well, yeah, but traditionally they were using watercrafts that were available to them, so they still do that. So it's curious to me that this is like this has to have some of properties, let's say, of being ancient. Like, well, you need to use ancient gear, you need to use oar boats, and you need to use and that makes it traditional. And somehow when you're using modern bow, when you're using modern boat, does this mean that it's not traditional anymore? It's it's interesting. Curious of your view on this.
So that my recollection of the tribal hunt in the Northwest is they did use traditional methods. They actually approached with a canoe out on the open ocean. They would harpoon, and then they actually used a modern piece, which was essentially a high-powered rifle, to deliver a fatal blow immediately. So the animal wasn't suffering. So there was this compromise. I think it's interesting about the Faroes in that it's a very specific hunt where typically the Faroes, I think, take pilot whales, and they took a very large super pod of a certain type of dolphin this time.
Yeah, I don't even want to mix that particular one hunt, because even Faroese say there was many things done wrong, and there were
people in that community who were like, no, this is not the way we do it.
Yes,
right?
Precisely.
And I think that the answer is going to come from internally for those types of hunts. Like, I think the hunt in the United States, there was I think in California, they stopped hunting mountain lions with dogs. So you used to track, and then you tree the lion, and then you shoot the lion. The advantage of hunting with dogs for mountain lion is mountain lions go, oh, there's a dog, I'm going to stay away from there, right? They learn to associate dogs with being chased. And so arguably, that's a pretty good way to keep them out of communities and keep them out of neighborhoods, because they associate dogs with something else. It'll be interesting to see if statistically, after the hunting pattern changed with dogs, whether we saw more pets disappear. Typically with mountain lions, you start seeing a problem when your cats and your dogs start disappearing. That's kind of a bit of a clue that you've got lions in the neighborhood and you need to have an awareness. But the point that you make, which is, do things need to be traditional? I think there's some merit to saying, if it's a traditional practice, then let's maintain that, because that's also often a way of self-regulating on the take. And so
true.
You have limited permits that are out there. That's one way to do it, and that's one of the ways they work with the buffalo hunt out in Montana. And then we have a lot of deer hunting, and you draw tags for different areas. And that tag's good for a year. You have specimen tags where you might be lucky enough to draw a sheep one year and you've been waiting 20 years to get that tag. But I think that discussion, particularly around what is right and wrong on traditional take, in truth isn't best answered by me. It's going to be best answered by the community that's advocating for that traditional harvest. And they should get to set, in large part, the way that they do that hunt, because it shouldn't be me.
Yeah,
like it's
that's exactly the point. That we again kind of repeating the theme of people in Britain or in the US, feeling compelled to tell some other people what they should do and what they shouldn't do.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nutty to talk to other countries about conservation and how you have to look after your marine stock of a certain type of fish when we've we've removed every fish, and we've
Man,
destroyed the seabed.
man, that is an argument. That is an argument that like actually that people from Ireland and UK, they probably should just shut up because there's like nothing.
Right, and in the same way, you look at the red deer population in Scotland, which is this enormous, umpteen tens of thousands of animals that has changed the ecology of Scotland. Like those herds have mowed it down, they've reduced tree cover, they've changed the vegetation type. They're in many ways a plague, and they need to be reset so that Scottish Highland and lowland on the coast could all come back. And that's what happened in Montana when the wolf got reintroduced to Yellowstone. There was this profound change in the makeup of the herds. Like elk populations crashed, coyote populations crashed, riverbeds changed. You saw there's some debatable science around it, but there's no doubt that the Lamar Valley that I saw 20 years ago and the Lamar Valley I see now in Yellowstone are radically different. There are more trees that are down in the creek bed. There are different areas of willow. There is a different feel. You don't see hundreds and thousands of elk sort of sitting around in the Lamar River bottom. They're up and away. They're up in the trees. It's reintroduction and restabilization for what was there, the ancient Caledonian forest. It requires decisive action. So if you don't introduce a major predator, you need to cull, because just planting trees with a bunch of wire around them isn't going to do it.
Yeah. But then I guess the whole problem hinges that also those deer are perceived by people who live there as a resource that they have, and they like, well, actually I like that many deer because we can have hunting parties coming in and leaving money in it.
So you could have sustainable hunt as part of that. You can have these other things, but I also think it's a Scottish question. It's not an English, Welsh, or Irish question. It's a Scottish question, and I think when we look at these other places to try and fix, like, and I just said, oh, you got to do a cull. That's an opinion, but it isn't really valid because I'm not living there. Is we need to look to our own. So, like right now in where I live in the United States, we have a really major feral pig problem. It's a cross between a domesticated pig and a Russian boar, so we call them hogs. And they're moving up from Texas. They've just got into Canada, and they're radically reworked the ecology. And pigs are clever, they're adaptable, they breed like crazy, and they're incredibly destructive.
But they're also tasty, right?
Well, yeah, so we saw them out on the ranch, and we saw them on the wildlife camera, and we're like, okay, let's get a permit. And
you need to have a permit.
Well, your depredation permit. It's like you could say there being a problem, and you can just shoot. It's like $10.
Okay.
And you, so you see that So I stalked this hog in open country just to check it out and see where the angle was going to be. And of course, they looked at me and they were like, "Oh, he's behaving differently. Like the dogs are behaving differently. We're all behaving." And like that, bam, they were gone. We didn't see them again. They just came back, actually, but caught them on the camera the other day.
But there's like, these are...
highly intelligent, highly adaptive, and they're going to change our ecology. So we have to have a profound approach. And there's a lot of trapping and shooting that has to happen in order to remove them from the system and then build basically a resilient management pattern so that we don't have this as an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, man, it's been absolutely fantastic conversation. Before we wrap this thing in, can you give our listeners and viewers a few fairly universal advice how to be safe in the outdoors, how to think, how to prepare, what you would do, like a rule of thumb?
I think the A is have a plan. Always have a plan, and always tell somebody where you're going and when you think you'll be back. because that'll save a lot of search and rescues, right? Because we know roughly where to look, and we kind of know when things might have gone wrong. So do that. I think be adventurous, but be realistic. And Paul Petzold talked about bad experiences leading to good judgment. The idea you go out there, you have a total epic, and you're like, I won't do that again. I think as a younger person, I'm really glad I had those adventures of bad decision making, but do it within a context of not getting killed. Like, don't.
Yeah, you were lucky.
Yeah, like on those cliff jumps, don't do the 80-foot cliff jump before you've done the 20-foot cliff jump to make sure there isn't a boulder below the surface. Like, start to build your resume of experience on this trajectory. Don't start way up here, start here. Have an apprenticeship. So I think being safe is making good decisions out there and going through what if, not to the point of paralyzing you from having an adventure, but thinking about if something goes wrong, have we got enough resources to get ourselves out of it? Because you talk about redundancy a lot in anchors. When you're climbing, you say if that anchor fails that we're hanging on, there's another anchor over here. We have redundancy in the system. And the first line of safety is yourself. And the second line is actually yourself, right? It's the idea that if it goes wrong, can you get yourself out of the problem? So if you're going to go next to water, learn how to swim. If you're going to go out in a boat, learn how to work an outboard motor beyond just taking the top off and rethreading the pull, right? Know where to twiddle stuff and where to dry stuff out. Be an apprentice to adventure, to not go so bold and so great for the Instagram moment that you haven't served your time learning your craft. And that's what I would say to people as a rule of thumb, is don't be afraid to go slow, because Instagram is a momentary image capture device that sort of gives a false idea of what's happened. And actually, what's greater is memory. Is like to have this thing where you've drawn on all these experiences, they've stacked up, and the moment you get tested, you cash them out because you can get yourself out of that problem. And so invest in apprenticeship, invest in having a mentor, and shut up and listen. Like, quite honestly, the saying less is you actually gain more is being. I benefited from amazing mentors when I started in the outdoors, and whether it was sailing across the channel and having a captain who could deal with incredibly complex situations and break them down to let the crew do a good job and watch how this man worked with the crew. That was an amazing mentorship. I think my dad's use of humor, like my dad's humor is unbelievable. You can find a joke in everything. And as a manager, he must have been amazing because he would have, he would have opened doors because people were relaxed and they would listen and be engaged. So when you're finding mentorship, it should entertain and should keep you engrossed. It shouldn't be a hazing, and it shouldn't be a trial by fire. It should be comfortable. Like, your mentor should make you comfortable in your knowledge, and that comfort translates into confidence, and that confidence becomes safety.
Yeah, these are wise words, Moose. What's your view on these devices that, like a GPS device or not even watches now, that have like a accident detection? Do you think these are good, or is it like just a gimmick and don't waste time on it?
So the first iteration, they were complete pain because people were using them. We had somebody out. The High Sierra is this sort of up and down, well over 10,000 feet, and you're sort of going up to 12,000, you come down to 8. And there was a guy who had one of those devices that he could send messages out. And he got to a peak and he just said, I'm having a heart attack. I'm like, I'm dying. And we're like, oh God. So you're getting the helicopter geared up. And then the next message, he was at 8,000 feet and he said, I'm not having a heart attack. I'm okay now. But we'd already launched. So he'd sort of come back. And then the next message later in the day was, I'm having another heart attack. And actually what he was experiencing was altitude, like heightened, like pounding hard because you've gone up in altitude. It's hard work, and so those first iteration, I wasn't that impressed by. I think now, if they're used wisely, they're fantastic. I think they have real application, particularly where you can message, I'm okay, I need assistance, hey, I need a pickup. Those ones I really like because they're precise enough in their search pattern to like zoom in. You can be really specific in your messaging. I think it's all down to the user. So I like them. And we had a very funny thing happen in Yosemite the last 2 weeks. A rescued dachshund. You know what a dachshund is? Like a sausage dog?
Yeah.
Got away from its owner, and it was wearing a little red jacket, and he was in Yosemite Valley, and he had one of those tags that tells you where he is, and it's a rescue dog. And for 2 weeks, it was on the loose in Yosemite Valley, and nobody could catch it.
For 2
and
weeks,
they put extraordinary amount of resources on the ground to try and capture this dog that's name was Puma. It was
of all the names.
And people were looking at it on their phone and being, there's a reporter Puma over in Lower Housing, and they run over there. And of course, it's one of these little dachshunds, so it's really good at going under rocks and hiding. Mm-hmm. And it went on for weeks. It dodged bobcats, raccoons, mountain lions, vehicles. It survived for 2 weeks with his little red jacket on. And they eventually caught it because he got stuck in the laundry over at the lodge and he couldn't get out. But I say this story because the adventure of Puma happened in real time with that little thing that was out there tracking. And so there is real application. And I like that. I think technology doesn't have to be the thing that breaks us. It should complement and add to our experience. And that's on the sort of spot devices, location things. Ultimately, if they avoid having to tell a mom that their child has died, that's a good thing, because the moment that you tell a mom that she has lost a child, there is an ungodly noise that comes out of her in a way that it's unforgettable. Like when parents lose a child, it's profound. When a mom loses her child, the emotional, the noise I have heard and I have experienced over the years is consistent in its horror. And so for all the inconvenience and for all the silliness with those things, if one mom doesn't have to get that message, then it's absolutely worth it.
Yeah. Well, let's hope like the less these accidents, the better. And once again, your book, When Accidents Happen, Managing Crisis Communication as a Family Liaison Officer. But like I said, not only if you even don't envisage being Family Liaison Officer or even work in the accidents, it's an excellent book on the psychology, right? There's really you talk a lot about how communication work, and communication is super important. So folks, buy that book. You're not going to regret it. And Moose, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really fantastic.
Tommy, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you last week, and this has been great. Thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to maybe hosting you when you get over to America. It'll be great to have you visit us and show you a bit around town over here.
You up on this? I can take you.
That'd be great.
Thank you. All right. See you.
All right. Thanks, buddy.